Hey, I'm Philip Zock, the creator of Nightfox Audio, and I wanted to show you how everything works in Grand Piano Suite, one of our products. Grand Piano Suite is a stack of 11 different grand piano textures, and you can see them all here on the bottom left. This is the main tab of Grand Piano Suite. You have at the top left your navigation between the tabs: Main, Arpeggiator, Effects, and Mod. So back to the main tab. In the center you have your Load or Save Preset box. You just click it to open this window, which lets you choose any of your presets, and you can navigate between them with these buttons here. Next to that is your global pitch and pan. So this is controlling the pitch and pan of the entire instrument. You can slide them like this, and then option click puts that back in center. The same is true of the pan. Here's your mute button, which silences all output, and then these are your meters, which are displaying left and right signal output. This gear icon opens your settings box, and we'll get into all of this later. So here's the main tab of Grand Piano Suite. On the left, you have a list of all the voices or instruments that are available to you. There's 11 here, and these are all grand piano textures and sounds that we've sampled. So all of these faders at the bottom control per voice volume, and I can mix and blend any of these sounds together pretty quickly using these knobs. A couple special things about the knobs: if you double click it, it puts it at -6. If you right click it, I can assign MIDI CC to it if I know my MIDI CC number, or I can just click Learn MIDI CC and turn one of my knobs, and then I have physical control over that parameter. That is true of any of the faders and knobs in Nightfox Audio Products. So when you're producing on the fly and you're using something like this, you can map a bunch of them and have physical control over those virtual parameters. So obviously I only have one fader up right now, so it's just concert grand piano. I'm going to go to the arpeggiator page, turn that on, that arpeggiator, and then I'm going to let that play it for me while I start to blend in some of these other tones. That way I can really quickly find a brand new tone with a combination of a bunch of those instruments. Another helpful thing, if I want to reset the values of all of those together, I can click Shift and drag down a fader, and it controls them all as a unit. So I can turn them all down and then double click one, and then I'm just hearing that one voice. Notice that if a voice is turned all the way down or blacked out like this, that voice is no longer contributing to the overall voice count, and that can free up a lot of really valuable CPU. You can hover over the name of a voice and click to open the voice attributes box. And this is awesome. Each of the instruments in Grand Piano Suite has its own voice attributes box. So in that box you have some voice attributes, some EQ, and a compressor. Under voice you have pan, and again this is unique to this specific voice. So you can pan every one of these separately and get a really wide stereo sound. You can also turn up width, but note that this will only work with instruments that have been sampled in stereo. You can change this on the mono ones and you won't hear any difference. And then this is input delay, which holds back the signal from this particular voice for any number of milliseconds. And this is really cool because you can set that to a different amount for each of your voices, and you almost get like a stomp effect. They're not all playing at the same time. Under EQ you have a 4-band EQ. Each band has frequency, shape, and gain, and a visualizer there to see exactly how you're shaping the tone. Under compressor you have threshold, attack, release, ratio, and makeup gain. This is really important. The makeup gain can dramatically increase the volume of this voice, so you want to make sure that your threshold is either all the way up or your ratio is all the way at 1 before you turn this button on, because it could get loud once you start making these adjustments. So we've given you all these controls per voice because that gives you a lot of control over where they each sit in your mix, and especially as they come together as a whole when they go out on your master bus. Across the bottom you have attack, release, cutoff, drive, and reverb. And then of course your master volume. Clicking on the word attack or release will open up the envelope box with controls for attack, hold, decay, sustain, and release. Even though all our instruments are sample-based, we can still apply this envelope and treat them more like a synthesizer. So really quickly with these knobs, I can shape that sound to be more plucky or to have a sharper attack. Hover and click on the word cutoff opens the filter box. And you have a drop down here of a bunch of different types of filters. A lot of times I'm using low pass, so I turn up the resonance. You can see how that impacts the sound. It's a nice visualizer too, so you can see what the filter is doing. Hover and click on drive opens the wave shaper box, and there are a bunch of different types of waves here. ATAN and saturate are my two favorites. This right here is your drive amount, which I've given you access to right on the front of the plug-in there. You also have a high pass and a low pass. Hover and click on the word reverb to open the reverb box, and here you have controls for mix, damping, stereo width, and room size. Mix is connected to that reverb amount knob there on the front of the plug-in. Damping rolls off high end on the affected signal, and then stereo width just makes that reverb wider. Room size will make it last longer, feel more like a cavern or a cave. And here's your master knob. All right, let's head on over to the arpeggiator. This is the arpeggiator tab, and it's the same on all of our melodic products, so I'm going to show it to you using Grand Piano Suite. To turn on the arpeggiator, click this button here. You can adjust velocities using your mouse here, and note lengths. Just kind of drag as you click, and it kind of randomizes a little bit. This hold button allows any note that's pressed to be added to the currently running arpeggio. So it's just going to do that one. I can just keep adding notes and it's going to arpeggiate all of them until I turn that off. Latch is going to indefinitely hold any notes that are played simultaneously. So I press those three notes and it's just going to arpeggiate those three notes. And then I'm going to press three different notes and it's going to switch until, again, you turn that off. MIDI through is really cool because it also allows what's being played on the keyboard to be heard in addition to the arpeggiated sound. So you'll hear this chord, and that chord rings out. Whereas if I turn it off, you're not going to hear that chord. So that's a really cool function for doing live stuff where you want to hear the chords and you want to hear the arp, and it all kind of mixes together. Down here in the blue you have steps. So as you can see up on the top left, the step number is changing all the way up to 32. I generally like to keep it at 16. Rate is how fast, according to your DAW, it syncs with your DAW, or you can adjust the global BPM and settings if you're using the standalone. It goes really fast, all the way down to full steps. There's triplets and other stuff in there too. Octave, right now I have it set to 1 octave, so you can hear it jumping between 2. And that's 3 octaves. That's so cool because it's playing a whole bunch of notes that I could never play on piano. So I'm going to put it back to 1. Swing adjusts the feel of the playback, so you can hear it almost stutters a little bit. So that's a cool way to bring some humanity into your arpeggio. Step size is kind of hard to understand, but it helps if you just look at what's happening here on the velocities window. So it's skipping because I put the step size up to 3, and I can put the step size down to -1, and it will run backwards. This is a way to just kind of randomize a pattern that you've already got built. I'm going to just leave the step size at 1, and then it'll march forward just like you're used to. Range low and high is a really cool way to split the keyboard. So the left hand, it gets ignored by the arpeggiator, and you can play full chords or big octaves or whatever, and then the right hand on above whatever value you select is triggered by the arpeggiator. So that's a really cool way, especially if you're good at playing piano, you can split the keyboard. The low side with range low, and you can do it on the high side with range high. The direction of the arpeggiator is easy to understand. I'm going to press 3 notes, so it's just going to go up. If I switch it to down, it's going to invert that, and if I go up and down, So another cool one is random, which kind of bounces around. And then chord gets really interesting when we get into pitch offsets, which I'll show you in a bit. It just kind of machine guns that, but if you're adjusting your velocities, you can kind of get some really cool effects using chord in conjunction with velocities and note lengths with your patterns here. Now let's talk about the pattern builder. So this is a really cool way to get really interesting ideas really fast because it does some generation for you. I'm going to click 8-step and I'm going to just roll the dice and see what I get. So it's just going to loop those 8 steps again and again. And I can do that with note lengths as well. So you get a lot of humanity in that kind of auto-generating arpeggiation. Then you can move them around like this until you find something that you're really happy with. You can keep rolling the dice, roll the dice. Here in pitch offsets, you have the dice, which randomly generates in your chosen scale a bunch of these values. You have an octave button, which restricts it to 1 or 2 octaves. So now when I roll the dice, it's actually going to use the full 24 steps. This button down here resets, so it clears it back to 0. This is where you pick your scale. This checkbox restricts whatever is currently drawn in the pitch offsets field to your chosen scale. So right now if I draw like that, it's not pentatonic, but if I click that, now it suddenly is pentatonic. This drop-down is called format, and it basically is what patterns repeat. So you have an A, B pattern, and that is dependent on your bar size here. So if you have 4 steps, it's going to be 4, 4, 4 of the same, and then it's going to do 1 different. And you have some different options down here. Random is just going to make a totally random set. The plus minus buttons here will transpose whatever you've got in that field up or down a half step. And so you can click that quite a bit to change that dramatically. And then these arrows move your pattern left and right in that field. So let's say that I've got a pattern that I'm really excited about. And I don't want to just bake it into this preset. I want to save that and use it in other presets. So I go to the Save button here, call it whatever I want to call it, pentatonic. It's going to save it in my art profiles. And then, even if I make a bunch of changes to it, roll the dice a bunch of times and it's different, I can go to Load and load that pentatonic, and it will always be there. So you can save as many of those as you want to, create really cool melodies, and use them across a bunch of different presets. All right, let's move over to the Effects tab. The Effects tab at the top has a macro section, which is really cool, and it can do a lot of really powerful things. And then at the bottom you have 3 slot-based effects, and you can put those on in any order. So I'm going to choose tape delay. And this one's really cool because it has a little bit of like wow and tape speed, and it rolls off kind of the high end of the effect. So you have a lot of controls over all of these separate effects through these knobs. Ping pong delay goes back and forth, and you can change the tempo of each side. Distortions, different than the distortion on the main tab, so you can kind of stack distortions. It's also interesting to add an eVerb, like an electronic reverb, and put it real big size, and then put a distortion after that, because it chews up the reverb effect. So playing around with the order of those effects is really fun. So have a fun time with that effects section. What we really need to talk about is this macro or expression section at the top, because all of these little knobs can make a big impact on your creative workflow. These 2 big knobs at the top, Expression 1 and Expression 2, act as macros, and they control 4 or 5 parameters at the same time. All of these parameters are effects that exist elsewhere in other tabs, and I'll show you what they're connected to. So I have Expression 1 mapped to my mod wheel, so I can control that really easily right here. And And right now, it's not doing anything because I haven't turned any of these knobs on. So I'm going to turn on cutoff, and right now this little knob is at 75%, which basically means this knob has the ability to control the cutoff knob 75% of its current value. So cutoff is here at 100%. Go back to effects, and I'm going to turn this up and down, and you can see that effect. See, it only goes down to 75% down, even though I'm all the way down on my mod wheel. So what's really cool is that you can set each of these effects. I'm going to turn on drive, and I'm going to turn on drive to only 15%. So I go back here, and drive is only going to move just a little bit while cutoff is swinging wildly. This gets really interesting when you're combining 4 or 5 together, because as you adjust this knob, so I'm going to turn release up to 50%, so you can see how all of those knobs here are changing differently based on the percentages that I selected in that macro section. This gets really interesting because I'm controlling 4 effects at the same time with this one macro knob. And I'll go through each of them individually. So cutoff and drive, like I said, are right here. That's the cutoff frequency right there, and the drive is the drive amount that shows up here. Gain LFO is connected to the mods tab, the speed. So like this. Really cool effect. And if I turn that down, it would only do a much smaller range on that speed. And the release button is connected to this release knob on the home page. So again, you can see how cool it is that one knob is controlling a bunch of different things. Let's move on to expression 2. This macro controls pitch LFO, reverb, ARP rate, filter LFO, and pitch. So it can do a lot of really cool stuff at the same time, and I recommend leaving pitch at 50%. Kind of where I've set these knobs is the recommended use, because pitch LFO gets really crazy if you put it any more than like 15 or 20%, but it's totally up to you. Pitch LFO is connected to the depth here and the pitch LFO on the mods tab. So you can see it's only moving a little bit because that warble gets really out of tune really fast. Reverb is connected to reverb on the main tab. It's important to note that if one of these is turned on, it activates the LFO that it corresponds to. The same is true of ARP rate. ARP is currently off, you see on the ARP tab, but when I turn ARP rate on here, it also engages this ARP button. It's going to speed up and slow down that ARP, which is really cool. And you have effect over the filter LFO as well. And that turned on that one as well. And then obviously pitch changes the pitch of the entire instrument. Again, I would leave that at 50% so that you don't end up offsetting the pitch of your whole instrument on accident. So that's how the macro section works, and I'm sure you're going to find some really creative ways to use those expression knobs to blend a bunch of different effects together and to shape your sound as you go. Keep in mind that you can right-click on either of those and apply them to whatever MIDI CC that you want to. On the mod tab, you have gain LFO, pitch LFO, and filter LFO. You also have depth and speed controls for each of those, and under that's a drop-down where you can choose your type. Sine wave kind of gives you that normal tremolo vibe. You have triangle and saw, but what's really cool is going down to custom and building your own from scratch. So when you're in the custom section, you can right-click to remove a point, or just click anywhere on the line to add another point and drag it around. Shift-clicking and dragging restricts the left-right movement of that point, and so you can keep it where you want it. So it's really fun to play around with, and you can get really interesting results from that gain LFO. Pitch LFO is a modulator, and it adds really cool, like tapey effects to your tone. The filter LFO here is really great because it is connected to the cutoff on the main tab. You can see it's moving now. And if I adjust that here, if I adjust the speed and the depth, you'll see that reflected on the main tab. Glide is a portamento, and it gives you even more control like a synthesizer. You have controls for time, range up and down, smooth, and then split actually splits your keyboard up to the value that you choose, so anything below that is not affected by glide. Using velocity curve here is a great way to help your performances feel more dynamic, because velocity curve determines the amount of gain reduction based on how hard the note is pressed. If I turn it off, there's not a lot of dynamic range there, and there's not a lot of gain reduction for the notes that I'm pressing not quite as hard. So if I turn it on and I create a curve that looks something like this, these lower velocities are going to play back at a lower volume. So it feels a lot more dynamic, it feels a lot more like a real instrument. And so I would highly recommend trying out a couple different curves and putting your own spin on that velocity curve until it feels comfortable like the instruments that you're used to playing. This is the Save or Load preset box in Nightfox Audio Instruments. To open or close this box, you just click in the text box in the middle of the header. You can search for presets here with the search bar by name, and you can click this star to limit your search to favorited items. To select a preset, you simply click on it and then click the X to close the dialog box out. Double-clicking will also load the preset, but to get rid of the box, you still have to close it. At the bottom here, I can add, rename, or delete a category, a subcategory, or a preset. I'm going to add a new subcategory and call it My Sounds. And then I click on My Sounds and add a new preset. I'm going to call it New Sound. I'm going to click the star next to New Sound, which puts it in my favorites. And so if I limit my search to the starred items, it shows up there. A preset will save all of my settings for any of these parameters on all 4 tabs. So you can see as I thumb through presets, everything switches. And all of this stuff is going to switch as well. Let's say that I've pulled up a preset and I've made some adjustments, but I want to save those adjustments. I can either save it as is, the current name, or I can add another one and give it a new name. Let's take a look at the settings page for Nightfox Audio Instruments. Click on the gear icon in the top right to open this box. On the top left, you'll see all of the MIDI controllers that are connected to your system. And if you don't see it listed here, that probably means it's not connected properly through your system settings. So go there first, make sure it's working in your audio MIDI program, and then come back to here and you should see it. Click on it and it will control your Nightfox instrument. Just to the right of that are the channels available to you through that MIDI device. I just normally click all channels because then it will recognize all of them. If you're doing some interesting stuff that's specified because of your MIDI setup, you can choose the ones that apply to you here. On the right here, you have a lot more options, and these have a lot to do with the way your computer is set up. An audio driver is a type of file on your computer that's used to recognize and interact with your audio device. If you're not hearing sound, it's possible that in your settings you haven't set up your driver correctly. This drop-down will display all the devices connected to your computer, and you normally set this up in System Preferences. So once you've set up your chosen audio device in System Preferences, it will show up here and you can just click on it. I have here a list of all the outputs available on that device. I'm choosing monitor left and right. Buffer size. This is the amount of time allowed by your computer to process the audio. If you choose lower numbers here, you'll get a much lower latency, so you'll get a more immediate response time. But higher values will improve your disk performance. So I'd go somewhere in the middle. Sample rate. This is the amount of times in a second that audio is captured. It's similar to frames per second in video. This number should match the number that you choose when you create a session in your DAW. Global BPM. If you have sync to host selected here, this will automatically sync to your DAW. Or if you're in standalone mode, you can choose whatever BPM you desire. Zoom factor, you can zoom in or out on the interface. And then streaming mode, you would select the one more appropriate for the hard drive that you are currently using. IRRE is a global function that adjusts the timbre and pitch of a tone that's struck multiple times in a row. And this is the amount to which that happens, and you can control each of those independently. Pitch bend. This controls the overall amount of pitch bend on your instrument. Not to be confused with pitch at the top here, but this corresponds to the pitch wheel on your MIDI controller. Clicking Clear MIDI CC is going to purge any of the assignments that you've made to parameters inside the instrument. So if you've right-clicked on something and learned MIDI CC, put it on your mod wheel, that can get rid of that assignment. You could also do that by right-clicking that particular parameter and removing MIDI CC. And that's it for the Settings tab.